Right, so I will open the proceedings if you like. Hello, my name is Steve Wardlaw and I am chairman of Emerald Life, which is an LGBT friendly insurer, and my job is to chair stroke manage today's proceedings. So this is not the first session from the LGBT Commission. So this, the focus for these next 2 hours is effectively looking at employment issues, employability, which may overlap, may be different, and also skills for the LGBT community to help them, if you like, tool themselves up. Equally, we'll look at how businesses can also help in that regard to ensure fairness and equality. But particularly, I think for these sessions with the LGBT Commission, hopefully we'll get to discuss some of the meat, I think, of solutions and recommendations from the panelists and also from the audience. And obviously, it's very interesting to hear when we talk about the audience makeup, which is deliberately kept very broad, industry, civil society, and the political world, your perspectives, I think, and how your organizations or you personally have approached the issues that we're going to talk about for today. So we have a number of speakers. There's a lot of, we've got a nice chunk of time, but we have got lots of speakers from very different perspectives. So what I wanted to do today is I am going to split the session into 3 chunks. And the idea is there'll be statements from the various panelists. I have some pre-submitted questions. If that was you, thank you very much indeed. And we will then also look at getting questions in from the chat function. So what would be great if you could enable your chat functions, and then we will look for questions from there. That kind of keeps it in a slightly more orderly function. So any questions on that? I know we've got Hal and Ben around to help on any tech. That may be help that I need as well as we go, but let's see. So effectively, that's that. When we get to the end, there'll be case study forms for attendees. So the idea really, the aim of this inquiry is obviously there'll be some thought leadership that goes on, but the aim is also for this to be a real collection, I think, of ideas, proposals, and how we're really going to manage some of the detail of getting to an equal and fairer society, if you like, particularly here now looking at employment and employability. So that being the case, if there are any questions to me or to the organisers, please do stick them in the chat. So what we'll do is we'll start now. So for the first section, section 1, which will be the keynote address from Iain Anderson. It's written here, former government business champion, but also all-round good egg and a man of thorough decency from his most recent actions. So if you wanted to chat for somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes, Iain and I'll scribe, so that may bring up some questions, but we have some set as well. So the floor, as they say, is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Steve, and it's good to be with everybody, albeit virtually, but it's okay. I think it has some benefits. It creates a much more nationwide, and I think in many ways much more inclusive conversation. So look, I'm delighted to be with you today. I'm sorry I'm not with you still as the UK's first LGBT plus business champion. It was a role I took on with relish in just September last year, and sadly set back in the early part of April. Frankly, I think there are moments when you have to step back if you disagree with the policy, and I did in terms of where the government has got to on its proposed approach on conversion therapy. That said, I'm kind of hopeful still that when the legislation gets into Parliament, that parliamentarians can do their thing to create a all-inclusive ban on that abhorrent practice. This is a really important conversation, though, and I'm sort of delighted to continue to be part of it. I'm kind of, as Steve knows, I'm not kind of going away on this subject. I have no intentions of going away on this subject, and I can see some faces today of people who've taken a really important part in this work, and there is still a lot to do. What I thought I might do, though, just up front, is just give a sense for the Commission and indeed for the audience of what I was trying to do, and indeed what I hope government will continue to do in terms of supporting progress in the workplace. The first thing that was very, very evident to me, and I was very ably supported by the team at the Government Equalities Office in my role. But the first thing is that government really, kind of amazingly, doesn't have an awful lot of data on LGBT. A lot of data on gender, there's a lot of data on ethnicity. But when I asked officials for data and evidence gathering around LGBT at work, there were quite a few blank faces. And in a way, that's sort of what I was trying to get underway when I was in the seat. I launched a consultation just a few weeks before I stepped back, really looking for examples of best practice, if you want to call it that, what works, but really guidance and information from business, large and small, to be able to feed government thinking, feed policy thinking. But that was the first thing that was really very surprising to me. When in the autumn of last year, I said to officials, what's out there? And not a lot came back, as I was pointed to examples around gender, good examples around gender, good examples around ethnicity, but not in this space. So I think, my kind of headline up front really is that there's an awful lot still to do, an awful lot of evidence for government to gather. When it's done the sort of national LGBT survey, when it looks at census data, I don't know if it's been capturing much around LGBT at work. So look, hopefully, and this is for others to do, there are parliamentarians on this call, but to continue to ask government what data and what evidence it is gathering. And indeed to ask the same question in terms of the development of thinking and policies from the opposition as well. So the first thing is the evidence base, and I think policymakers need some. The second thing, and it was one of the first things I said when I again stepped into the role, was so much of this conversation was focused in and around large businesses. And there's some great work going on among and from the companies that are in the big co sector, they're in FTSE, that are kind of publicly quoted. There's some great work as well that is celebrated in the public sector. And I think when you look at a lot of the kind of awards and activity that takes place in order to sort of celebrate a great work, it is pretty much still amongst large companies. And I think we need to widen that. That's something that, I've said to Stonewall, I said to government, I said to organizations that create the opportunity to celebrate what goes on, but there's not a lot been taking place amongst SMEs. And I was really thrilled to get a conversation going on about that, and even more thrilled, and I see Craig from the FSB online today, when I think a lot of the support that he provided me and the FSB provided me was to support that focus. And actually seeing the FSB, since I've stepped back, launch their own fantastic initiative to put together LGBT plus entrepreneurs to share best practice, to buddy up, to think about how they can go faster, and also too how they can work with large work into supply chains. I think the supply chains point is a really important part of this. Is absolutely great to see, because, and this sort of takes me on to my next point, which is all the way through my time doing this role, and absolutely sense. The thing that strikes me is that we need to put the D&I conversation, or DE&I conversation, together with the conversation that's been going on around ESG. Yeah. And a lot of companies have made quite significant, quite profound commitments around the E part of ESG. They're grappling with what to do around the governance part of ESG, but they really are at a bit of a loss as to what to do about the social part of ESG. The past 2-3 years has made that even more profound. The questions are coming thicker and faster on that question. And I think that, for me, one of the most important parts of this, to lock in change and to lock in change for a long-term basis, is to put together this conversation, which is traditionally sat in the DE&I bucket, into the ESG conversation, because I think that's where investors and customers are, and really what's moving CEOs and what's moving boards is the ESG conversation. So I think that needs to be a part of this. Several other things. I think we all need to be honest with ourselves in that there are some parts of the economy that are doing better than others, some sectors of the economy that are doing better than others in terms of LGBT progress at work. And one of the things also I tried to do when I was in the role was to get a bigger focus on the sectors that don't naturally always come to mind. So, started kind of conversations with the automotive sector, with manufacturing, with oil and gas. I literally, a few days before I stepped back, had been due also to travel to parts of the UK where, sometimes the conversation is less evident or more difficult to do. So I was due to get on a plane to Belfast. The politics around LGBT at work, the politics around the LGBT community in Northern Ireland have been, more difficult to do. Let's be absolutely frank. So, there were a couple of things there for me. One was focusing on sectors and being honest that it's not great everywhere, and then also focusing on parts of the country where it's just been harder to kind of achieve change. The final point for me, was the idea to build forward from some of the international declarations that have been put together to support LGBT at work. The UN has done a lot of great work. Other organizations have done too. And the one thing I was looking forward to, I think many of us were looking forward to, was the idea of the UK leading a global conversation at the planned LGBT Global Conference. It was planned to be a multilateral event, so very sad that that's now not taking place, not least in the heady throes of just the past few days. I think there was an opportunity for the UK to lead. I completely understand why that's now not been possible in 2022. but I think it's really important that that remains an ambition. And we've worked very much on a international business declaration, which, like my earlier point around ESG, would ensure that businesses would be able to be held to account in terms of progress. It wouldn't just be a box-ticking exercise, that folks would have to think about not just themselves, but also think about their supply chains. And the supply chain point brings me absolutely back to large and small businesses being able to work together. So look, that's not been progressed, but I very, very much hope that the idea that was lit up over the last 8-9 months to create a meaningful business declaration, one that would be tested, one that the kind of tires would be kicked on a regular basis, is not an idea that's gone away forever. I very much hope that that's an idea that policymakers, that the business community, that the LGBT plus community can take on as well. So I hope that gives you a really good sense, Steve, of all the things I was trying to tackle, where my focus was. There's some stuff still to celebrate in there, but there's some stuff definitely where I would say could do better. And with that, I'll hand back to you.
Great. Thanks for that, Iain. That was super comprehensive, and I appreciate, your actions in there. There's probably much done and much more to do. So perhaps a couple of questions from me based on what you've just said there, and then I'll go through the pre-submitted questions. So the first one is I think you're right. If you look at some of the big city and the finance, all this kind of stuff, they tend to have teams that are fairly well tooled up on the importance of this, and their shareholders want to see something in the glossy brochures, so they're incentivized. The SME section, I think, is still one of those where it's vital because of the numbers of people who are still employed in there, but it can be quite difficult to perhaps incentivize. Some people will get it and some people won't, and it may be seen as largely a slightly self-selecting group as to how they want to take this forward. Did you? I mean, were there discussions on how you could incentivize people to focus on this more, or was it more an educational idea where you had to try and get people to understand why? It's kind of carrot versus stick.
Yeah, I mean, the government role actually came out at about from an event we done in the spring of 2021, where government approached me and they said, look, you do all this LGBT and business stuff. How about if we were to do an event? I said, yeah, but from my perspective, how about if we did an event that focuses on sectors of the economy, parts of the economy that doesn't usually get focused on? That's why we ended up with an initial conversation with the SME sector. What I was really interested in was and surprised and delighted by, in some cases, the number of folks that wanted to put up their hand, and that was good from the SME community. But there was an honesty, I would say, to that, Steve. There wasn't the sort of, sense of, oh, well, let's just, display our beautifully Greek and beautifully branded and end-to-end approach to this. There was a real honesty to being able to depict the fact that people were willing to learn. Yeah. So, and as I say, was so delighted to then see the FSB absolutely lean into my work, and to actually start to sort of build out. And I think that's how, kind of one of the real, I think, tangibles for me was the fact the business groups were prepared to be very, very supportive. I want government to go further. I want government to go faster, without being prescriptive. SMEs, I don't think any business wants an awful lot of red tape and regulation. I don't think any business wants that. So No, for me, it was real, it was honest, there was a sense of, there is an opportunity here, we can't solve it on our own, you know, we'd like to have partnerships. Yeah, that was refreshing, rather than, as I say, the sense of, well, we know the answer.
And I know we've discussed before the concept of there's two types. One type is red tape, which can be seen as bad, but sometimes that needs to tie into what you said firstly with data collection, because I think particularly in perhaps the SME sector, although it's various diverse strands, but that's probably where you don't have resources to be looking at this, and whether there's, you know, particularly on the more sensitive issues of employment rights between what we'll just call competing groups, you know, a clarity there, whether there's even guides or things, and that may be something with the LGBT Business Hub that I think we'll talk about very shortly. So there are some, I've got the questions pre-submitted here. I want to come back for a wrap-up general question with you. I don't know if that was a warning in by the end. But in the meantime, I know some of the people who submitted the questions are actually in the room as well. So what I could do is perhaps I'll ask you if you wanted to read your question out. If you don't, by definition, if you stay silent, I will read the question out for you, but just as we've got that there. So let's start. We've got the first question on my pre-submitted questions was actually submitted by Baroness Barker, who is in the room, as they say, even though it's virtual rather than physical. I don't know if she wanted to read that question out, or I'm more than happy just to take it on.
Iain, please ask for me. Please do it.
Okay, that was great. Okay, so a general question was, and interesting enough, there's a comment in the chat section from Craig about the small biz population is diverse, and Liz's question really relates that to some of the LGBT plus sections. So how can the different initials within the LGBT plus acronym best support each other in relation to employment and equality in the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, I think that broadly, there's what I would say over the few months I was doing the role, is broadly, folks are very supportive of each other. Yeah, I think I've found very few examples. In fact, I don't know if I think one example of where I was lobbied. From a sort of divided rule perspective, people trying to, you know, pull one strand away from the rest of the community. So again, I think the good news is firstly that people were standing shoulder to shoulder. Mm-hmm. I think the second thing I would say, and I actually ended up sharing this thought with Peter Tatchell too, as I grabbed a loudhailer 4 or 5 days after I'd stepped out of the role, was that business, large and small, was broadly shoulder to shoulder with this as well. I know a lot of people have, you know, sometimes say, well, you know, business rocks up for pride and disappears again. I think actually this was an example broadly where business was prepared to stand up and be counted for LGBT plus, and all parts of the community. To directly answer your question, though, I think that what I did find was there was, as there is, I think, in the public debate, a lot of businesses and individuals did come up with a lot of examples as to how trans folk are being supported. Yeah, mm-hmm. Particularly around healthcare. And nearly, obviously, I know, Steve, that you'll know with your own work. Mm. And that's fantastic. But I would, you know, reflecting on my work, I found it quite difficult as to get lots and lots of examples fruitfully across L, G, B as well. Yes. Yeah. So I think that is a challenge, I think that best practice and what works needs to light up across all the strands of this work. Now, I don't know whether or not organisations, public, private, large and small, were reaching into what they're doing to support trans people because of the headlines right now. It's very possible that that's what they were doing. But I think my honest reflection is that I think for all elements to support each other, we need to see lots of great examples across the piece. And I don't know whether or not folks have sort of, let me be provocative, rest on their laurels a little bit about some of the stuff that they've been doing for a long time.
Yeah.
And are reaching for some of the newer things and some of the pointier debates, and therefore, are losing a little bit of, what they're doing across the piece.
No, I mean, you're right. I think a lot of headlines, and for some of the questions we've had pre-submitted as well, clearly issues about equality for trans and non-binary employees has kind of chopped up the rank, mainly because it's difficult to open a newspaper some days and not see a piece on this. But broadening from the LGBT plus as well, a minor dip into intersectionality, is there a way to kind of reconcile support for trans and non-binary work colleagues with some of the, if I say gender critical, you kind of understand that, some of the views that are being expressed where it's almost a slightly more philosophical debate in the workplace, which may have a benefit, but may also distract, of course, from the essence of running a business as well. So is there a way to try and reconcile that, or do we need to be more clear? Is there education piece in business sector? I don't know what your thoughts are.
I mean, there's definitely an ongoing education piece that is relevant here, Stephen. I come back to it though. I was really very heartened when I took the role and when I stepped back as to where business was. There's not a lot of commentary about businesses are very afraid to get in this area, that it's a bit fraught, a bit difficult. They see where their customers and their staff are coming from. And I do think that actually it's quite a lot of politics that's in the wrong place, rather than necessarily businesses. There was quite an interesting piece, some of you may have spotted it, I think about 10 days ago. I lose track of the Jubilee celebrations, that the FT ran about woke capitalism. And I think what you're referring to or touching on, which is woke capitalism eroding individual freedom of speech for employees in the workplace about what they think. It's quite an interesting read. I'll see if I can dig it out before we finish. But I think the questions around freedom of speech are very different to actually how you operate at work, how you operate a workplace, how you operate a respectful and tolerant place where people come to be fulfilled and fulfill their dreams and to develop. So I mean, I don't think these things can and should be exclusionary, but I do think how people are setting out their values and how they want to operate their organizations actually is a matter for them. It is a matter for them. As long as they're operating within within a regulatory and legal framework, there's huge opportunity to basically set out the stall that you want to portray for your business.
I think that's right, and I think we're looking at some of these conflicts, and it comes back to, I think, some of the data collection as well. It feels to me like there's a rather than a one-way flow, maybe the GEO should be doing more on data collection, and then that data on purely numbers, and then perhaps data on lived experience could be disseminated as part of that process?
Yeah, look, I think that is a good one. I mean, government always has a bandwidth question, candidly, that there is. But I do think, that call for evidence that I launched, I think it's still out there. So there's still the opportunity to put stuff in the hopper.
Yeah, that makes sense. A couple of specific questions, really, and may have come up from some of the data that you collected in that period was really affecting. Perhaps, are there specific barriers that you found for the LGBT plus community? Is there anything that you can extrapolate as a general principle? And also, have you found, maybe too early to bring it out, some of the more hybrid styles of working now? How has that affected some of the LGBT employees? If you've come across any data on that in terms of accessibility, group support, etc.
So, I think, sorry, can you do the first one again? I've got a memory.
Yes, it was very specific. So we had a question from Yvonne Shaw, who's the team leader at West Lothian Council, on did you find, I guess, specific employability barriers to the LGBT community,
yeah,
and some good solutions to that from employers?
Yeah, sorry, thank you. I can only do one thing at once. The barrier point, I think, is to a large extent still sector by sector. Yeah, and I had a very, very frank dialogue as I say with someone in the automotive sector, also someone in the oil and gas sector, where I'm originally from Aberdeenshire, so know that sector very, very well. And I think what that said to me, Steve, is that when you look at some of the folks that continue to win awards for great stuff, yeah, there's, I think if we're really honest with ourselves, we can still probably pull out about 4 or 5 sectors that are doing really, really well. So legal and professional, financial services, constantly, retail, constantly come up. But when you think about manufacturing, when you think about oil and gas, when you think about some other parts of the economy, there are still some inherent barriers. Yeah, and I kind of point back as well to my to my sort of geography point as well too. I do think there's a lens on this that's about sectors and a lens on this about geography. On the point about what is hybrid doing, I think what I sort of could see was that hybrid's having the effect that maybe it's just having more widely on all of us, which is if your passions can't be seen, if your interests can't be seen, if you cannot be seen, there's a chance that folks are missing out in terms of opportunity. And again, I think just this lens of arriving at particularly what it means for those who started work through the pandemic, and their opportunities and their abilities. I comment was made to me several occasions. We're trying to keep our LGBT network going. We're trying to keep our Pride network going, but we're finding it much harder to maintain momentum. And we're still we're not a pandemic today, we're in a tube strike, but we're in London at least. I think there is that impact still in terms of some things have been lost. Some of the intensity of some of the activity has been lost in the last couple of years. And there is an opportunity to sort of build it back and think about ways to build it back in a sustainable way. So yes, I mean, on the hybrid question, it's again particularly the sort of new entrants into work that I've seen hit most profoundly.
Okay, I know I'm getting sort of slightly virtually poked to crack on a wee bit. So let me do that kind of like 8:59 Radio 4 Today program question. Obviously, for understand some of the background, various reasons, it's a shame the global conference didn't take place. And you'll see in last week's data that in terms of LGBT plus equality, the UK has gone from 1st to 14th place within Europe. In the few seconds we have left, as they always say, what are the 3 bullet points that, or 2 bullet points that business can do to try and help, and in the employment sector particularly?
Yeah, look, the thing that absolutely attracted me to doing this job, pro bono, for government, was the chance to make the UK global leader. The thing that has made me most hopeful, and I've alluded to this before, so when I step back, what was the fact that business was still really hungry to want to do this, and wanted to stand up and be counted in terms of wanting to do this. So, you know, a lot of businesses, particularly inward investors into the UK, were really very, very excited about what the UK might be able to do, but also what the UK might be able to do given, you know, some of the interlinked issues. And just thinking about all that we've celebrated over the weekend about the UK's place on the Commonwealth, but I think we would all agree in this conversation there's quite a lot to do in the Commonwealth in terms of LGBT progress at work. What can businesses do? Well, businesses can continue to, I think, most effectively work with their supply chain. Businesses can continue to provide evidence to policymakers as to, both in government and as those in opposition, about what effective progress looks like. And, you know, one of the reasons why I absolutely deliberately picked a sharper focus when I was doing the role on the SME sector, a sharper focus on sectors that have not necessarily been winning the awards, was because, you know, sometimes that resonates with politicians. You know, and politicians think about SMEs as voters in a way that they don't think about big co as voters. And I was just really thrilled that we were able to make some progress along the way.
No, I think that's great, and you're absolutely right. I think all these things have to have a political attractiveness to them. Otherwise, they are a headline, and we've had a few of those, and not much happens. Okay, well, what I want to do is move on to part 2. So basically, of course, as ever, many thanks to Iain for that section. Don't forget, of course, you can always put questions in the chat as we go forward. And if I can, just an advance warning to Craig Beaumont, if I can squeeze a couple of minutes out of the agenda before we go, perhaps you can explain something about the LGBT plus business hub as well, because I think there's probably some practical ideas there. But for now, thank you very much, Iain. And we'll move on to section 2 of the session today. And we have, hopefully they're all here. I think I've seen them on the screen, so that's great. We've got 4 speakers and then a series of questions relating to them. So I'll list them all very quickly now, and then I'll call on them to make a sort of a background presentation on some of the practical ideas that we can perhaps implement and some of their experiences for, say, 3 to 5 minutes, and I'll do the Q&A. So the 4 people we have for part 2 will be Mo Wiltshire, who's the Director of Governance of Stonewall, we know, and then Leng Montgomery, who's Senior DE&I Consultant at Charlotte Sweeney, Harry Queenborough, Co-Chair the E&Y Employee Network, and then Tom Steele, Senior Consultant and LGBT Network Chair at IQVIA. So on the simple basis of the order in which they're written, I'm happy to pass over to Mo Wiltshire for her comments in sort of 3 to 5 minutes, and then of course we'll always wrap back for the Q&A. So over to you, Mo. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, I'm Mo Wiltshire, and my pronouns are she and her, and I actually wear a couple of hats at Stonewall at the moment. So for the last 3.5 years or so, I've been Director of Education and Youth, and I'll explain why that's relevant in a moment. As you rightly say, I am Director of Governance now. So what that means is that it's my team that supports the Workplace Equality Index, and also develops and supports a number of the guidance materials for employers across the sector. So briefly, as many of us will know, Stonewall was formed 32 years ago now, directly in response to the introduction of Section 28, which many of us were, especially if we were educated in the UK, experienced themselves at schools or are aware of it. And that was the piece of legislation that prohibited the promotion of homosexuality in local authority maintained schools. And that was not repealed until 2000 in Scotland and 2003 in England and Wales. And I start there because I think understanding the shadow that many of our employers who have had experience of education in this country, and those of our staff members who have come through the system, it's really important to recognise just how recent that that period of history has been in the UK. In my role in education and youth, we work with schools and colleges, and we work with local authorities, and we also work with young people directly themselves. And we support kind of various research projects, including a really important one that you may be aware of. If not, I can put in the chat, which was called Shut Out. And that we produced in February 2000, as we realised in terms of the 2018 LGBT Action Plan, there was a really important group of our community that was missing, and that was our LGBTQ plus young people who are not in education, training or work. So when we look at that wider employability piece, and actually the lessons we can learn from those who are currently neither in education nor training nor the workplace, and what it is that has created that situation, I think there's some really interesting lessons that we can learn in terms of our wider workforce progression and retention for those actually in workplace as well as those seeking to access it. And on the back of that report, which I'd urge you to read, there's a number of recommendations at policy level and employer level. We've created a resource called Young Futures, which we launched in February, where we work with a group of young people themselves, not in education, training or work, as well as some sector leads to bring together information on actually breaking down what we mean by employability in terms of understanding the different routes and ways to access different ways into different sectors of our across public, private and third sector, understanding how to articulate skills and what it takes to have the confidence to feel able to be out at work in a different education setting and to navigate a space where we are able to support all of our workforce to feel that there is no need to make a choice between being our true selves and actually fulfilling our potential in the workplace. So I would also encourage you to explore our Young Futures website. Within my new role in terms of governance support for the great work that Stonewall's been doing over the last few decades, we have the Diversity Champions programs where we work with workplaces, again, across all sectors. We have roughly half and half public-private sector, actually, interestingly, and a range of different size of employers, although the larger ones are more represented. And we also have a Workplace Equality Index, which has been going for just short of 20 years and is free to access, but it looks at those employers across 8 different broad categories. So that's looking at the different elements of employees' lives and the workplace setting to look at actually how effective inclusive cultures are supported and what really works in terms of LGBTQ plus inclusion in the workplace. So that's looking at policies and benefits, the whole life cycle, support for network groups. We've already heard how important they are today, the challenges of sustaining them, empowering individuals, that leadership piece, actually the data and insight elements, and again, as Iain spoke to, the supply chains and the potential to really create change more broadly through procurement and supply chain routes, as well as, of course, external engagement. And the other area that we work on that's part of that workplace equality index is the staff feedback questionnaire, which gives us really interesting insight. All participants in the indices undertake it. This year, we were able to achieve 79,000 responses that helps us understand and paint that picture over time of actually what's working in terms of good practice in LGBTQ plus employment, employability and employee progression. And so the key themes that we find from the insight that we've had, both from our work with young people, not in education, training and work, and those, the insight that we get through our work with diversity champions, as well as through the indices, kind of could be distilled into a few different themes. So firstly, and it's obvious in a way, but employability and understanding of what the world of work looks like and the choices we're going to need in order to navigate it successfully starts from school. It's a really important point that we are integrating our work across as employers with education policy, so that we ensure that we have careers guidance that reflects the increasingly progressive world of work, so that our young people, as they move into it, understand actually what options are available to them. The second is about not only the importance of good policies, and that our workplace practices align to those policies so that they're fully understood across our workforces, but it's also about the perception. So I think we know that there's lots of good practice out there. There's some practice that could be even better. But actually, if we only understand this once we've entered into the workplace or taken that next step in terms of progression within working with an employer, actually, if that is not perceived to be as inclusive as it actually is from the outside, we're unlikely to get kind of that speed of change that we know is really important. The third is about thinking about limitations of LGBTQ plus colleagues and being able to kind of fulfill their potential, because energy is finite. And we know from our research, so alongside the information that we get through our staff feedback questionnaire, through the Workplace Equality Index, we also do big pieces of research such as LGBT in Britain reports looking at workplace experiences. And we know from that we still have very high levels across our communities of those who are unable to be their true selves at work. And alongside that data from 2018, again, happy to post a link in the chat, that was confirmed that in this year's Stonewall feedback questionnaire, the staff feedback questionnaire, we found that still nearly a quarter of all respondents didn't feel able to be themselves in the workplace, which rises to 27% of bi respondents, 33% of trans respondents, and 41% of non-binary respondents. So we're still finding, in terms of the energy that we have to apply to being ourselves at work and performing in a way that is most fulfilling for us and for our employers, actually there's an element of energy having to go into not being our true selves that is clearly an additional barrier. And then the last point is around data, and then I'll finish.
You do it super quickly, Mo, because we're
sure. Last point on data is about ensuring that we are using what we've got, and to actually borrow the words of someone else who actually worked for EY, it's about looking at the other end of the telescope. So where we know what's working for our wider workforce in terms of sense of belonging and being able to thrive, making sure we're applying those lessons to supporting development of our LGBTQ plus staff. Thanks.
Thanks, Mo. Okay, we'll crack on. I know we've got a few specific questions on exactly that kind of thing about practical steps on data collection and how we can bridge data gaps and things like that. So next, I'll ask for some brief comments from Leng, who is Senior D&I Consultant at Charlotte Sweeney.
Hi there, thank you. Actually, it's Charlotte Sweeney Associates, and we're not a diversity and inclusion private detective agency, even though that name kind of sounds like it is. I've worked in DEI now for about 10 years now, and I've sort of I came from more of an activist perspective, so my pronouns are he and him. I've come out 3 times, not because people gave me presents, it's just being honest and being the truth. So obviously I first came out as a lesbian, I transitioned 13 years ago this year, and I'm also proudly bi as well. So the main thing I've learned, obviously growing up in the shadow of Section 28 and things like that, is that people do treat you differently, and it does have quite a nasty and quite destructive legacy. And I think what informs my work as a leader, but also as a consultant working with businesses, it's helping them get their heads around, and also to keep promoting the fact that who you are and who you love should not be up for debate, and that's a right. And if we are telling businesses, or we put our marketing and our messages out saying we want people to bring their whole selves to work and all of those kind of messages, then actually that does include people that are LGBT. And I think a lot of the issues lie in the design, not just of company policy, but of society. We are not, things are not designed for people that are not white, cisgender and heterosexual. So because of those factors, it involves different conversations. And I think working with some of my clients globally, though, I've actually had my eyes open to a lot of things, but have a lot more hope, because I think it's really important looking at things with an intersectional lens, that we take attention to be allies to each other, but also don't make stereotypes of other countries just because there are typical countries that we know may have shown perhaps not so much law or legislation that supports an LGBT colleague. We have to stop thinking it's just those countries that automatically are being less inclusive. Because I say this because sadly, I'd say the UK now is one of the most transphobic countries we could possibly live in. So again, I think we have to look at things broadly, and we have to look at what's there and how we can all make action together, and stop fighting with each other, or stop letting people divide us in those situations. So really, in terms of the work that I've done and what I've noticed with businesses, I think one thing that does need to be a priority is not just talking about Pride when it's June, but actually thinking about what happens for people the rest of the year, and ensuring that policies and procedures are being kind of inclusive of that, but also making sure that you're thinking about your colleagues, your customer, your client at all times, because we are all part of society. And I think the more we lead with our hearts, and the more we consider thinking about everyone as humans rather than just a different group of people or a demographic point, that is going to be our way forward. And there is actually some progress being made, but it's just by having, I suppose, having that authenticity and making sure that there's stronger allyship in these conversations, because obviously there's a big discrepancy in terms of board representation and management representation. And I think in the subject of employment, we do have to cover the fact that it's great to have role models that are LGBT, but we have to be doing more to set them up for success and to actually promote them further in the companies, so they don't just sit there like ornamental Fabergé eggs. And I'm happy to take more questions on that later. Thank you.
Thanks, Leng. No, we are going to come back on some of those. The questions for section 2 are admirably specific, so just be warned. All right, and then opening remarks, please, from Harry from the E&Y Employment Network.
Thank you very much. This is Harry, and good afternoon to everybody. My name is Harry Queenborough. I identify as a cis male. My pronouns are he, him, and his. My sexual orientation is bi, my preferred abbreviation for bisexual. So to clarify, I'm the community lead for EY's bi community. We use the term bi plus as an umbrella term to all those who identify within our organization as experiencing attraction to more than one gender, and therefore could include pansexual, omnisexual. Also, this family of terms is known collectively as multisexual, compared to gay and straight and lesbian, which are monosexual terms. So I'm an associate director at EY, and as I referenced, I founded EY's bi community and also an intercompany forum to share best practice around bi inclusion in the workplace. The Bi Inclusion Summit, we brought together 30 of the world's leading employers with around 2 to 3 million employees collectively, to really dig deep into the experience of bi people in the workplace and to co-create what a bi-inclusive workplace could look like. So in that role, I've worked with some leaders in technology, finance, oil and gas, media, and others to help activate and catalyze formation of their bi-plus communities. I'm proud today to provide a voice to those in the workplace who do experience attraction to more than one gender, the bisexual and pansexual communities. The bi community, which is the term I'll use collectively today, is the largest and the fastest growing demographic across all LGBT plus identities. Based on an Ipsos 2021 Global Pride survey of the global population, 11% of Gen Z identify themselves as bisexual, pansexual, as a percentage across the total LGBT plus population, which was 18% of the global population, compared to 4% of the lesbian, gay, and homosexual populations. Trans and non-binary was reported separately as a gender identity report versus a sexual orientation report. Moreover, it's by far the fastest growing sexual orientation demographic. Those identifying as bisexual or pansexual was across Gen Z was 5% higher in Gen Z compared to the millennial population. This had gone up 5% between the millennial and the Gen Z populations. These proportions are reportedly much higher in UK specific surveys also. And by comparison, the growth of lesbian, gay, homosexual population was 1% between millennial and Gen Z. Yet bisexuality and bi people remain underrepresented and largely invisible in the workplace and indeed society at large, and is often erased or omitted from discourse around LGBT inclusion. Bi people are far less likely to identify openly in the workplace than gay and lesbian people, by example, and 43% are found not to have engaged with their LGBT network. 22% of bi people were found by Stonewall to be out in the workplace, compared with 57% of gay and lesbian people. Bi people are similarly far less likely to be out with their family and friends, and they're far more likely to experience a lack of belonging. As the LGBT plus population grows in size and diversity across the different generations, driven in particular, as I referenced, by the higher self-identification across Gen Z, as bi and pansexual, there's a growing need and opportunity for employers committed to LGBT inclusion to refresh, and I use the phrase modernize, their approach to LGBT inclusion and proactively seek to cultivate a culture of belonging for bi and pan people in the workplace. Today, efforts to cultivate belonging for bi people have been limited or even wholly omitted from workplace approaches to LGBT inclusion. Bi people widely lack community, role models, representation, and support. They continue to lack a sense of belonging and remain largely isolated. This will impact their career prospects, development, and progression. Moreover, this is particularly problematic as it impacts their mental and physical health and well-being compared to straight, lesbian, and gay people. Again, data also reported by Stonewall. 59% in Stonewall's 2021 bi report found that 59% experienced depression compared to 46% of gay and lesbian people. 50% reported life was not worth living compared to 35% of gay and lesbian people, and 26% reported self-harming compared to 11% gay and lesbian. Those statistics alone should be a wake-up call for workplaces and indeed society at large to really engage their bi populations and cultivate a sense of belonging for them. Business in particular is well positioned to build upon its pre-existing commitments to LGBT inclusion and strengthen representation of bi people. Here are a few lessons learned based on our experience. First of all, we must recognize and seek to better understand the diversity of the LGBT community. In my experience, LGBT is really spelt with a silent B in most thinking and discourse. We must commit to cultivating a culture belonging specifically for bi plus people in the workplace and ensure that bi perspectives are represented in LGBT dialogue, DE&I strategies, and policy-making processes. We must invest in education and awareness around the unique issues that bi people experience. We must cultivate allyship towards bi people within the LGBT community, as well as outside the LGBT community, to tackle some of the prejudice, intolerance, and discrimination that can be experienced within the LGBT community, as well as outside of it, and build community among bi employees, bringing them together through bi specific events, activities, and major celebrations such as Bi Visibility Day. And my final point is we should not wait to be asked by our bi employees to be included. The data demonstrates that they exist, yet they remain highly stigmatized and underrepresented demographics in society. And they tend to prefer to remain invisible often rather than put themselves at risk and being out. So to conclude, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to participate today, and I look forward to sharing further some of the experiences that we've gained working within my workplace of 300,000 people worldwide, and also other leading employers also. Thank you very much for having me.
Great, that's amazing. Thank you, Harry. And we are going to come back to that when we look at kind of a proper definition, if you like, of inclusion. And lastly, for the introductory remarks, Tom Steele, who's the LGBT Network Chair at IQVIA and a senior consultant there as well.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. So yeah, I am the co-chair of IQVIA's LGBTI network here in the UK. I'm a senior consultant. I'm a management consultant by background and an economist. By day, I typically have been advising government on public policy and have been working on things around domestic violence and gender policy as well, housing and healthcare. But alongside my day job, sometimes I colloquially call it my gay job, I've been working as their co-chair over in the UK in what's called their Employee Resource Group, which is one of a number of support networks to help foster an inclusive work environment within IQVIA. So we've got other networks across multi-faith, gender, and different racial ethnicities as well. Prior to IQVIA, I actually worked at Ernst & Young as well for a good 5-year stint. And over in their Australia office, I chaired their LGBTI network in Melbourne, and I also sat on their Diversity and Inclusion Council. And alongside those roles also, I was on the Australian Labor Party's LGBTI Policy Committee in Victoria as well, working across some of these issues. It was fascinating earlier listening to comments around data collection. These are conversations that we've been having at IQVIA and that we were having over in Australia as well. I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned across these different geographies. It's been fascinating joining the IQVIA business and seeing how they structure their network. It's a lot more, it's very globally driven. And so there's a lot of lessons being shared across different countries between the US, the UK, and across Europe at the moment, and also the Asia Pacific. We were speaking earlier as well quite a lot about intersectionality, and there's so many opportunities there for us to really pull together our resources between each other, between these different networks and our different diversity of experiences. Lots of low-hanging fruit to really tackle some issues where we can make a real impact for our people in our community. So I'm very excited to be here today and talk about all these different opportunities together. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Tom. I know we have quite a few questions for section 2, so exercising chair's prerogative, there are some very specific ones. I'll ask each of you a question if you like, and then if we have some time at the end, we can do a follow-up as well. So I'll start with Leng, because I know a bit of your background as well, Leng. One of the questions we had was looking at effectively managing senior buy-in, because one of the things we see, we've talked about pinkwashing and sticking rainbows up for Pride Month. What is it that makes an organization truly get this running through their veins? And if it's senior buy-in, how do we do that in a way that is inclusive and not tokenistic?
Great question. I think one of the main ways that I think really solves that is actually really working directly with senior management with inclusion in general. Something that we've discovered at Charlotte Sweeney Associates in a book that she created, which we identify is that lots of people know holistically at senior level that being inclusive or engaging with diversity and inclusion and equity is good for business, or it's the right thing to do. They don't know how to do it though. And there's often a lot of fear, there could be ignorance, there's relinquishing responsibility, systemic inertia, or people think I haven't got the time. So I think having certain programs or even support in place to help them better understand the needs of inclusion in general and understanding why that should become a priority. I also think from an organizational perspective, which in effect is their responsibility, if they're thinking about their main business strategies, DE&I should be part of that as well. It shouldn't just be a separate sort of policy, so everything's all siloed off. And also within that, I think really strong governance. So obviously having people actually having actual responsibilities, because the businesses I've seen that have been really successful to get that buy-in generated have had responsibilities towards certain key priorities, which often should be LGBT as well as gender, ethnicity, or disability and other areas like that. In that instance, they know it's something they should be doing. But also, I think it should really be down to the values of the company or whoever's deciding to put those into places, as well as to what their criteria is with inclusion or what are their commitments, because I think it's that sort of holistic responsibility that I think has to be taken in. And it should, you know, yes, we all in business at times, we have to produce business cases or we have to put forward, you know, why we should do things. But I also think that, you know, we also have to challenge people in those roles as well at times. And it shouldn't just be about us basically waving and going, please like us. And can you please, you know, in that sort of situation, because that's still perpetuating power structures and hierarchies, even though a lot of companies claim there isn't a hierarchy. We know there is a hierarchy. So it's like, how do we all play our part effectively? So I think that's one area. But I think in terms of getting the buy-in, I think it's just being very clear as to, you know, basically being very clear on the values of the organization or what the priorities are, or when we talk about very openly what the culture is, it's showing that we're trying to uphold and keep that momentum going and we're being authentic, and also bearing in mind with some areas of business case, actually, you know, how many consumers we have, how many of our colleagues, if we are known to be of, you know, any demographic, particularly of LGBT, but also our customer base as well. Let's remind people that actually, you know, when you're LGBT, you're going to use those products, services, and you're going to be a customer themselves, because that sometimes makes people go, oh yeah, because it's like, we're not just, you know, sort of rainbow party animals that people think of us in Pride as, you know, we are people the rest of the year, and also, you know, we will be your customers or your client as well. So I think it's really, really important to remind people of those facts. And I found that by putting all of those elements together, that generally helps generate a lot more buy-in. And if there's still a bit of resistance or whataboutisms, well, you know, that's where other conversations have to take place, or, you know, it just depends on the sort of tone that an organization's setting or what it really wants to prioritize.
No, I get that makes a lot of sense. And that's quite interesting, because you've gone, which helps me with my next question, gone from, if you like, the general principles and ethos of the company into a kind of a data-driven exercise. So it's both, it's because it's the right thing to do, and if you like, and here's some of the stats behind it. So that leads me on to a question for Mo. There's a question that's coming into the chat from Emma Cosmin, and you talked a bit more in your remarks about progression and kind of retention and things like that. And she has referenced a 2019 YouGov poll that said there was an LGBT pay gap of about 16%, so averaging about 6,500 just over of a lower salary for an LGBT employee per year. Has that come up in some of the Stonewall work, and is there advice that you give to the participants in the surveys, the Workplace Equality Index, on how that might be managed?
Yes, I mean, I think it's been such a theme, hasn't it, throughout today, around where we have data and where we don't, but more importantly, what we do with it. And I think the data piece is an absolutely critical element of any organisation's kind of LGBTQ plus inclusion plan, because as with any organisational change, we talk about it kind of being as easy as 1, 3, 2, which is, firstly, you've got to really understand where you are. What are the key questions you need to understand as an employer about who is in your workforce, how likely is that their full life cycle, what actually you understand about your employee base and their satisfaction, their sense of belonging, their retention, their progression through the different elements, depending on the size of organization. And so and work closely with networks to understand that through intersectional lenses as well. So that's 1. 3 is agreeing that organizational vision, the end point of actually what does success really look like, and that's where understanding, you know, what it is, what will it take, which is the second step, to get to achieve that vision. So how do we close the pay gap? How do we reduce gap in employee engagement or satisfaction? How do we ensure that all of our employees feel that our workplaces are those in which we can thrive, so that ultimately, you know, as I say, we have more fulfilling experiences as employees, but also the reason that organizations exist means that, you know, more engaged employees means we're more likely to be delivering in a way that the organization needs us to. So yeah, start with insight, then go to vision, then work out what it will take to get there.
Brilliant, perfect. I think that's all part of it, and it's the buy-in, I guess, that makes sure there's a retention issue as well, so that people can see, and this is part of the internal promotions you do, people can see efforts are being made, even if sometimes we always like the results a wee bit quicker. But you mentioned there kind of employee networks, and so next I'm going to fire off to Harry for the next question. So Harry, particularly with some of the stuff you talked there about the bi community, how do employers become, the question is actually was put down was, how do employers become employers of choice for the LGBTQI plus community? But I thought perhaps with some of the background you discussed there, you may feel that not all of those letters are in sufficient font size as they could be. So how do we ensure that across that broad spectrum we get employers to be seen as employers of choice?
Yeah, thank you very much, Steve. So I think in my discussion, I cited the data, the shifting LGBT demographics, the kind of growth among the bisexual, pansexual, omnisexual populations, but also the asexual populations, trans, non-binary. So it's really important that every touch point throughout graduates, throughout their job application process, you have fair representation of the LGBT community, diverse representation of the LGBT community at those touch points, whether it's at the various campus events, the online their online experience, the communications. It's about achieving diversity. So, for example, we'll always use our pronouns when we attend graduate events. We also, as an employer, participate in major sort of student pride, and we also post roles in LGBT-specific media and job recruitment sites. We also do proactive outreach to LGBT university societies to explore options where we can support them and their sort of next steps as they seek to find employment post study, we really kind of ensure that the way we communicate our commitment to LGBT inclusion is diverse.
Great. That's interesting when you talk about the outreach as well. We talked a bit more, and I was just mentioned there by Mo and then by Leng about the ethos. There's a lot of questions about data and sufficiency or lack thereof. But I think what we find, and I come from an insurance background, and it's very, very difficult to get people into insurance that aren't everything you'd expect people in insurance to look like. So it's fairly self-fulfilling in the end. And I think the outreach early on, like lots of industries, and back to what Ian Anderson was saying before, like lots of industries, there are ones that are seen as more attractive and some as less attractive. And the ones that are less attractive, that can be largely things that we brought on ourselves. And so widening it and probably having buy-in from people who are definitely a different generation from someone like me, particularly in the outreach and the first recruitment stage, is probably vital. Okay, so I'm going to pose a question now to Tom, and I think this is more about progression. So we talked a bit there about Harry and outreach and doing student pride, and when you're recruiting, showing the breadth of thinking within your organization. So like all these things, we see it with people of color, and we see it with women, and we see it with LGBT. You can do the best job of recruiting people, and yet you watch the attrition rate as they all disappear off in the first 3 to 5 years. So are there any ideas about effectively helping LGBTQ plus employees rise into senior leadership, both from what they can do and perhaps what the leadership teams can do as well?
Thanks, Steve. I wouldn't say there's a one-size-fits-all response to what this looks like, and different organizations are going to have different capacities to support their people in these ways, and also depending on the type of business that it is. You mentioned before attrition. There's probably some opportunities in really showing to your employees just how important they are to your organization, that you can create that safe space for them. And I've had my own experiences along my own career where the senior leaders within my organization, they've stuck up for me, for example, when I've had run-ins with clients, or when there's been concerns around marriage equality debates that were impacting on my well-being. And it was those experiences with the leaders who I worked with that actually, for me, created such a sense of loyalty with the organization and helped me be able to bring my own authentic self to work. You cannot be at peak performance if you're spending most of your day concerned and worried about whether or not someone's going to act in a certain way. To give you just a very short anecdote, one of my first days onto an engagement, when I first started consulting, the partner slammed a pencil case onto the desk before a client meeting. It was the LGBTI network pencil case branded. On the back, it had guidance, hot tips on how to be an ally. She wasn't suggesting that I was a raging homosexual or not. That probably came across very obvious anyway from my own perspective. But then she said that there's like a grammatical error on the back and said to go find it. There wasn't. It just forces people to read it. But it was those sorts of experiences that I had from the senior leaders in my organization that built up that genuine personal connection that really, I eventually left that firm and moved on to other things, but I certainly still have quite a strong connection through them. Beyond that, though, mentorship is huge. So I've got my own mentors still from that firm, and in IQVIA now, we have a mentor program that we're setting up. It's sort of in its second cycle at the moment. Previously, in other organisations, I've participated in reverse mentoring as well, where a junior staffer, or maybe not necessarily junior, but of less experience, who might be from the LGBTI community, or there was the other D&I networks are involved as well, and they were mentoring the senior leader in what it was like to be in those positions. And it's having those, being able to build out those networks really helps propel your career forward. The last thing that I would think about too there is very important to not let things slip through the gap in terms of intersectionality. So when we're thinking about some of these programs, not everyone's needs are all going to be the same. You'll have those in the LGBTI community who are gender diverse. You'll have those who are male or who are female, who will have their own things and needs and opportunities to sort of bring along the way. If we can collect some better data on some of the things to better understand what is compounding issues around. It's not just about being a queer person who's trying to get promoted, but also there's the gender pay gap and other things like that. And there are different needs there. So these are all important, and I would think you've got to think about the pipeline all the way through from that beginning all the way through to the end. And then once you have those senior leaders in place, you got to show them off, because if you can't see yourself in those senior leaders, you don't know that's the sort of future that you can have.
Brilliant. Actually, that was a super answer, because it actually brings us on. So firstly, of course, we have to move on for the final session before we get to the wrap up. So thank you to the speakers. And we have a slightly a different angle for the next panel. And funnily enough, it is about a bit more intersectionality. So thank you to obviously the four of you who spoke today. So Mo, Leng, Harry and Tom on this front, and we'll move on to section 3. And what I'll do is the same as we did for section 2. So I'll just briefly announce who is speaking, and then we'll just go through in order for the headline remarks, and we'll perhaps focus a little bit more on some of the intersectionality questions. And then going on from that, we'll have the wrap-up remarks. And I haven't forgotten Craig from the Federation of Small Businesses either, if we can get onto that as well. So, right, so for section 3, for our final section before concluding remarks, we have Mann, who's the ED&I advisor to the Mayor of London and secretary for the National LGBT Police Intersectionality Group, Gurchaten Sandhu, who's the president of UN Globe, and Sarah Stephenson-Hunter, who's the founder of Simply Equality. So again, in the order that they were presented to me, perhaps let's start with Lax and his introductory remarks. That would be great. Take it away, Lax.
Okay, thanks, Steve. So yes, my name is Mann. So I'm a serving Met police officer. I have previously served on the LGBT staff network as a committee member for intersectionality and community engagement, and now I sit as the secretary on the National LGBT Police Intersectionality Group. I do have a unique lens through this, I think, because a lot of the discussions I've come from different sectors. I started out actually at PwC and qualified as a chartered accountant many years ago when I worked in international finance for Deutsche Bank and also for Jones Lang LaSalle. And so I started out as if you like, on my D&I journey as one of the co-founders of PricewaterhouseCoopers' Ethnic Minorities Forum, which it was called at the time, about 25 years ago. And this mirrors my personal journey through work, if you like, because I've gone through that corporate sector, been very active in those race and ethnicity discussions in those very, very early days of diversity and inclusion, when this topic was, if you like, coming across the pond, and it was very new to UK, and it was corporates that were picking up the agenda at the time. And then subsequently went into the charity sector for 2 years, but actually while I was at Deutsche Bank, I had actually come out myself as a gay man and joining Deutsche Bank's Rainbow Network, and then becoming more active in those LGBT plus spaces, and also then community volunteering. I'd always done volunteering and pro bono work, but getting involved in that community angle as well. A volunteer for charities, and particularly I did 5 years with the Black Gay Men's Health Campaign, Big Up, which was very much about targeted interventions, small media, mass media, tube posters, films, documentaries at the London Film Festival. So very much that all-inclusive, looking at things through the, if you like, the Black gay or the Black bisexual male lens, but always understanding, well, what is it that's missing for the South Asian community? Which led me then on my personal journey of bringing all of these things together, that intersectional lens of me embracing all the aspects of my identity, being South Asian, being of Punjabi cultural heritage, having grown up in a Sikh faith background, coming from a working class background myself from the Midlands, and bringing this all together. And I think another career change was there about doing more, and I guess my social conscience kicked in, and I joined policing as a serving warranted police officer, but very much out brown gay from the outset. And I've been very active ever since on the inside of policing and out. So as I mentioned, doing those committee things within policing, and also sitting on the National Race Action Plan, one of the internal working groups, and looking at that and what the impact is. And that's the National Police Chiefs Council and the College of Policing Joint Race Action Plan, and having the contribution into that from the LGBT plus intersectional lens. The other side of it, as I mentioned, I do a lot of community volunteering. So yes, a Mayor of London Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Advisor. I sit on the advisory group for Sadiq Khan. It's a public appointment. But then along the way, just mirroring my own personal journey, I am the founder of Gay Asians UK, which I specifically created to amplify the narratives of the South Asian queer community in the UK. And that was several years ago. I started on that journey about 7 years ago, maybe 8 years ago now. And fully launched it at Pride in London in 2017, which was very much, the tagline then was Queer Asian Here. And it was very much about saying that we have arrived and we will tell our narratives wherever we are, whether that's in the workplace, whether that's in community. We take ourselves authentically where it's safe to do so. And subsequently to that, I've gone on and I'm now a trustee for South Asian Heritage Month, and I've been the LGBTQ plus lead from the outset. So that's very much about bringing those narratives into the forefront from the outset on a national cultural festival. And that does include working with businesses and partnerships, corporates, also with the civil service. They are very much taking on board South Asian Heritage Month. And I will field queries, I will get involved, I will help curate and co-create events, very much through that brown queer lens, very much around inclusion. Just a few things I want to point out as key themes, I think, for me over that journey of 25 years in DE&I. And some of this has already been touched on by the other panelists in the questions and the talks, and I'll just go through them briefly, is that intersectional lens. It's just viewing the whole person and understanding that there are different aspects of people's identities. Some of those identities will have benefits, they just will, and others, you will experience barriers and challenges. So it's just understanding the intersectionality angle. A second thing has already been alluded to is about dominant cultures, and like we're talking about here in the workplace, dominant cultures. So if you carry through that intersectional lens and you look at who benefits from those main dominant cultures in the workplace, in employment, and what happens when you have multiple dominant cultures, and we've talked about this, whether that's race, whether that's heteronormativity, whether that's able-bodied, and how those become the workplace norms, and how it then becomes difficult to challenge because they are entrenched culture. And we've had some questions around that. And then if you carry that through to the third thing about privilege, power, and influence, 3 different things, but all do relate to each other, but are not mutually exclusive. So looking at it again, carrying through that privilege, there's a privilege in people getting to the senior positions, they've worked hard, they have a privilege of what they can do there. There's privilege in having gay privilege, which has been alluded to. As a gay man, I have male privilege, I have gay privilege, I have able-bodied privilege, English as a first language privilege, educated privilege. It's understanding what your privileges are and understanding that where people don't have them. And then the power. We've had a question about how people rise to the top and what can be done. But when people do get there, it's the power. How do you use that power? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it soft, hard power that you utilize? And then also influence. Because you can have power, you can have privilege, or you can have neither of those two, but you could still have influence. And again, how do you use that? Who has these 3 facets, privilege, power, and influence? And then you carry that through into, I think, the fourth theme for me is about oxygen, and I term it oxygen as we all need it, and it's just simple in the workplace. A simple question, are you okay? Can you breathe? And these things have been alluded to in how can you change these workplace courses, just understanding that people have a stake in it. If everybody can breathe in the workplace, then you're doing okay. But if somebody can't, give them oxygen. Make sure you've got your own oxygen. Who controls oxygen in the workplace? Who's got that privilege, power, influence? Who gets to turn on the taps? Who gets to release more oxygen? Who gets to do more? And that's very much, I think, staff networks come into that. And then the final point I just wanted to mention, which again has been touched on, is about that solidarity. And what does it mean in the workplace? What does it mean to have allyship? Is it performative? Is it real? I just literally today read one of the internet articles in policing of one of our senior assistant commissioners, and I think it's probably one of the most heartfelt articles I've ever seen somebody senior in policing write. And it's coinciding with Pride Month, and I just thought, well, yes, this is progress for us in policing. But just understanding that for some people, I think possibly moving towards comradeship, I think, because people are thinking, well, everybody's an ally. Why are things not happening? Everybody wants to be there and be seen to be an ally. And I always use the analogy of he for she. You see a lot of men coming forward as allies, but I think women are unfortunately having the same conversation every year. So I do question, what is the allyship actually doing? And just a final point to round up on, I know all of this is wrapped up in a lot of these conversations about bringing your whole authentic self to work. And I just have to caveat that with, it has to be safe for you to do so. It has to be emotional safety, physical safety, in order for people to actually turn up and show up and know that the workplace has got their back. So that's just a quick overview of my career, my thoughts and ideas. Thank you.
No, that's brilliant. Thanks, Lax. And we're going to come back. I think I'm thinking about some of the stuff. We've got some more general questions at the end, but particularly I think dominance and safety is quite an interesting thing about how you can explore, and people learn about intersectionality all the time, and it can be one of the most confusing parts of this discussion. Okay, so second on the list is Gurchaten Sandhu. So I can see that they are here. Brilliant. All right, fire away with your remarks, please.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Hi, yes, I'm Gurchaten Sandhu, pronouns are they, he. Just a bit way of introduction, I'm not the president of UN Globe anymore. After 16 years of working at the International Labour Organization, the UN Specialized Agency on the World of Work, I am now the Director of Programs at ILGA World. For those who don't know, ILGA World is the largest global LGBTIQ+ federation, made up of 1,800 plus members. We are, so to speak, I've moved from one UN agency to another, the LGBTI version of the UN. We bring together LGBTIQ+ communities together to make global consensus on where and how our communities are going. We're very unique in the sense it is queer democracy in action. So a lot of my background on my experience particularly comes to the from my experience of working at the International Labour Organization, specifically on the issues of fundamental principles and rights at work. Now, I think a lot of my conversation pertains to the earlier ones, my talking points. And I think that there was a lot of discussions around the issue of what happens before work. I believe our colleagues from Stonewall raised it eloquently when we talked about education. Prior to education, I think, well, with education, we're also looking at inclusive technical vocational training as well as formal education systems. If we also sandwich it with the end of work, what happens when you lose your job? Are there adequate social protection systems in place and safety nets to catch LGBTIQ+ people once they fall out of work? Okay, so yes, we know that LGBTIQ+ people need to be treated equally in the workplace and need to have access to jobs, but what happens when they don't have access to jobs? Our colleague from the Trade Union Congress, Emma, raised some excellent points as to what happens when you have many LGBTIQ+ people living in poverty. So that's the other part. Then there's the issue, as it's been mentioned numerous times, is the issue of mainstreaming LGBTIQ+ rights. Yes, we talk about discrimination in the workplace. Yes, it's great to feel included, safe, and well. But what about the gender gap, the pay gap in particular? And it's not just about the gender pay gap. This is about equal pay for work of equal value. So you're not just looking at the type of work we're doing, but you're looking at the value of that job. We know that LGBTIQ+ people are often found in very feminized sectors, i.e. hospitality, healthcare, entertainment industries. Where do we, and consequently, as a result of that, they will then, the gender pay gap will impact them more adversely. And that's where the issue of solidarity within our communities is integral to this. The other aspect I would like to raise in terms of talking points would be around data. Indeed, Iain mentioned the importance of data collection, but how are we collecting data, and when are we collecting the data, and how are we collecting it? For example, let's just take what happened during COVID. The UK government backed down on businesses, saying that we do not need to collect data on gender pay gap. In fact, inadvertently impacting the LGBTIQ plus community. So when we make measures that impact women, it inadvertently impact the LGBTIQ plus community as well. So it's not just looking at collecting data in terms of consensus, but are we conducting labour force surveys? How are labour inspectors examining the issue in the workplace? How are how are violations of discrimination being reported? Currently, with the UK legislation, only one violation of type of discrimination can be reported. In fact, when we know that in terms of intersectionality, we have more, people, LGBTIQ plus people may be facing multiple forms of discrimination. Today, the conversation a lot of it has been focused around employees. In fact, when we look at the UK Employment Act of 1996, it does talk about three types of workers: employees, workers, and those service providers. When are we going to start having the conversation around workers and not just employees? And that brings me to the next point, which is around gig workers. A lot of the work and a lot of the discussions have been about people in formal contractual settings, when we in fact know globally LGBTIQ plus people are found in the informal economy, where they are most found in the informal economy and not in the formal sectors, where they're going to face the most heinous violations of human rights abuses, where they're not going to be protected from and they're not going to have social protection provisions. So what do we do in those cases as well? When are we going to start having those discussions? So the gig economy, the platform economy is very, very important discussion. And when it comes to intersectionality, indeed, why do we find many LGBTIQ plus people of color and faith in that type of work, in those informal economies where they are not protected? I think then it goes on to, and I'm really glad that Craig is here as well. I think indeed, federations of small businesses, someone who's worked with the International Labour Organization, tripartism is essential to this discussion. Bringing small businesses and bringing federations of businesses to the fora is important, so that they can have dialogues with their trade union counterparts, and providing that platform is key for government to do. And that brings me on to a very dirty word: regulation. Regulation is fundamental here to ensure that the playing field for businesses and for workers, all workers, is made equal for all. And then that's it finally. I think, one of the questions I would like to hear Craig to also answer is, do LGBTI chambers of commerce really work? Because I think, the evidence really points to that they don't. Do LGBTI chambers of commerce really need to start working with small business federations and integrating into those federations, rather than having standalone LGBTI chambers of commerce? So that's one thing. That was one of the questions I would like to point to, Craig. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Gurchaten. That's super, because that means I will have to make time, which I was going to wait for Craig to get onto that. So I'll make a note that doesn't get overlooked. And lastly, for introductory remarks, we've got Sarah Stephenson-Hunter, who's the founder of Simply Equality.
Thank you. You hear me okay, Stephen?
That's great. Thanks, Sarah.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you very much for the invite to take part this afternoon. I'm aware of timing, so we'll try and keep it brief. So in terms of my background, I am the founder of Simply Equality. That's the work I do around the issues to do with disability and LGBT. I wear many hats. I also, in my day job, if you like, work at the University of Oxford as staff disability advisor and trans lead. And really, this has all been as a result of my personal journey. So I don't mind disclosing. So I am a trans woman, and I'm also disabled. So I'm totally blind. I have a history of mental health issues, and I also have a physical condition. And for me, this whole question of intersectionality, isn't just a funky buzzword that we chuck around in DE&I sectors. But it's a fundamental lens through which we need to look at all these equality issues. My colleagues and fellow panel members have already touched today on issues around gender, around race, and they are, they're important. But I think sometimes the world of disability and LGBT can very much be seen as the sort of the poor cousins, if you like. And for me, I have always been disabled. My issues with my health, my disability were there from a very young age. I've obviously always been trans, but I didn't realize I was trans until much later in life. And so for me, most of my sort of formative employment was navigating the worlds of being disabled and what that meant and what the challenges were and discrimination. I've spent most of my working life within the public sector, within higher education. And I've chaired disabled staff networks, I've been involved in other groups in that area. So I was quite familiar with the world of disability regulation, disability discrimination. So I foolishly thought that when I came out as trans and when I started my transition at work with a previous employer, that, well, I'll be fine. I've navigated one world of equality, I'll be fine in another. And I was actually quite mistaken, because although I had that general vocabulary and framework of equality, I realized that there weren't many people like me who were both disabled and LGBT. And when I started to deal with things like gender clinics, again, I was the one educating them about what it meant to be disabled and how that might impact my sense of who I am and my gender identity. And so that's when I got more involved, and that's why I do the work I do now, training companies, private, public. And really, for me, that whole section of intersectionality is fundamental, because we've heard it several times this afternoon about bringing our whole self to work, and that's fine and that's valid. But that isn't just LGBT, that's disability, that's BME, that's the whole panoply of equality. And I think there are some key lessons we can learn. There are some key issues, obviously, that are specific to disabled people, to LGBT people. But I think for me, some of the key lessons that I've learned through supporting staff and from my own experience are, firstly, that whole question of disclosure. And now, obviously, within the realms of disability, it's important that we create spaces where staff feel able to disclose they have a disability, because obviously in that context, there are issues around, putting reasonable adjustments in place, making sure that the law is met and that support is available. And so I can't remember who it was mentioned, I think it was Lax, talking about that psychological safety for that environment to disclose. And as much as that's true for disabled staff, I think that's also true for LGBT staff. And yes, we've talked several times about the importance of data and data gathering. And I think disclosure is important for those issues. I firmly believe there's an under disclosure of disability and LGBT within employment. We have to create those environments where people feel safe to disclose, where they feel that disclosure isn't just going to be something that's ticked off in an equality monitoring form, but where it's actually going to have a benefit, where it's going to make a real difference, and where when you do disclose, you sort of do it once and you tell your employer and you won't have to keep doing it. I think it was Leng earlier talked about coming out several times. I feel sometimes I have to come out several times, be it my disability identity or my gender identity. So I think creating that sense of disclosure and that framework for disclosure is important. I think also for me, when it comes to intersectionality of disability and LGBT, that whole issue around our equality networks is important. Certainly something that we've tried to do more at Oxford is, okay, yes, we do have our LGBT network, our disability network, our BME network. As I've said earlier, there are specific issues that are key to those issues. But I think the more we can work together as equality networks, we've had words like ally and comradeship mentioned this afternoon. I think that's fundamental. The more we can do sort of cross-network events and the more we can have speakers at events that do intersect the different identities, the more we can have, chairs of networks that intersect those identities, the more that shows people that it's not just about being LGBT or BME or being disabled, it's about being you, whoever you are. And again, I don't have the stats, but you know, the numbers of disabled people that are also LGBT are just quite phenomenal. So obviously there's those issues of equality networks. There's also the issue of role models. Again, I think we're great at having role model programs and LGBT role models. You know, I am an LGBT role model within Oxford. But again, making sure that those role models are from an intersectional group of people, be they disabled, be they BMA, be whoever they be, that those role models aren't just your usual typical types. There's also the issue of policies, and I know policy is difficult, but policy should create a framework that does bring about equality for all. So, you know, yes, you may have your separate trans guidance policy, you may have your disability policy, but again, making sure that all those policies are put through that intersectional lens to make sure they're not inadvertently bringing in ableism or other forms of isms that are inadvertent, but can be an issue and can create problems. So I think those are the key issues. I think the work is ongoing. I think it's really fantastic to see where these things are happening, but I think there is a lot more work to be done in that area. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And I'm going to come back to you. What I'll do is I'll do the same thing again with specific questions for each of you, but I will come back on some structural issues on intersectionality because I think that's going to be vital. But perhaps just in the order that we went through again. So if I could pose a question to Lax. We've had a question from Robert Maguire, him, who's the commissioning manager at Sutton Borough Council, but I think it's a slightly more, it's a broader application than public sector. He's written, how could we be intersectional in our approach when we look at LGBT plus employment, employability and skills? So back to the core of what we're discussing today. And he's written, especially where learning difficulties are involved, but I think let's broaden it out to say, how do you manage to be inclusive of LGBT plus stakeholders, let's just keep it wider, in an organization when you're trying to manage what may be competing intersectionalities?
Yeah, sure. So I think this alludes back to what I was saying earlier in having that intersectional lens is understanding that different aspects of people's identities and also understanding dominant cultures. So for some people, if you like, the starting point of an approach to LGBT visibility will be done through a white lens, will be done through a male lens, will be done through a gay lens, will be done through a certain class or disposable income lens, not necessarily through a working class background lens. And so those dominant cultures come into play when we have a starting point of let's be LGBT plus inclusive. So it's understanding that and taking a backward step from that and understanding where do we actually have the dominant cultures at play, what lenses are given prominence, and how are we moving forward as an employer in terms of how we actually looked at things in the round, and are we actually being fully inclusive rather than looking at it in one lens, if you like, as we've managed to do LGBT plus because we've got a white gay male of a certain earnings potential, if you like. So there's the approach in terms of, you know, I think somebody else said earlier, one size doesn't fit all. You do have to look at it in a much wider perspective. And I think if you just honing in on learning difficulties, for an example, is understanding yourself more, is going on that journey of learning, is understanding what is it that you're trying to do, what is it that you as an employer needs to be conscious of, what is it that I mean, in this particular, public sector, but it could be a particular company, it's your customer base, it's your client base, it's your service users. What is it that you need to be providing? What is it the product that you're selling? What is it the service that you need to offer? And understanding your base so that you've got an understanding of who you're trying to reach out to. You've got an understanding of what you're doing before you're putting your sort of foot forward. I think there's always that thing of take that time to understand it more so before you just go out there. And to widen it out, I think in a wider intersectional is, again, it's been mentioned earlier about silos. It's understanding that more people have these different aspects of their identity and they aren't just called upon to say, oh, we want to have an LGBT plus lens on this. Okay, fine. And then separately, we want to have people of color come forward. Well, as a queer person of color, I can give my lens just as one person in one consultation. You don't have to ask me certain questions, and then I would have to be part of a different staff network to be part of a different consultation. And so that in itself, and I think Sarah mentioned it, is staff networks themselves need to open up. And so when you're looking at approach to employment, who you're employing, employability, and what the skills and how people are allowed to flourish in the workplace is what I call the push-pull analogy. And if you look at it from an LGBT plus thing, what you tend to find a lot of workplaces, they'll have an LGBT plus network, and it's very much driven around pride events and, you know, we want to be visible and we want to do this. But if you're there as a person of color, for example, or you want to talk about racism, you want to talk about sexism, sometimes you get this thing, oh, well, actually, you need to go to a different staff network to have that conversation. And then perhaps you may go to a race or a faith or an ethnicity-based conversation, and you say, yes, but I happen to be queer, and I personally use the term queer. And people say, oh, you need to go to the LGBT plus network for that one. And so you have this push-pull where everybody wants you for the numbers. The LGBT network wants you to march in pride and be on a poster, but doesn't want you to talk about racism in the workplace or gender discrimination or having a disability and being queer. So it's this push-pull, and I think those staff networks really need to embrace intersectionality in terms of what is the work that we need to do, and how do we need to collaborate, and how do we need to reach out. And the onus, and again, it goes back to my point about dominant cultures. If you are part of that dominant culture and you have that power, privilege, and influence, and you acknowledge it and say, I need to go on a journey of learning. And I think that's a lot of the time, the pressure is always put on people who are in the minority cultures, who are not in the dominant culture, to do the work, to come up with the solutions. Well, actually, no, it's the dominant culture that needs to do it. It's not for queer people to stop homophobia, biphobia, transphobia. So it's just flipping it on its head and actually saying, people need to stand up and be counted. And then hence the point is it an ally, or do you need to go further and be a comrade?
Great. Now that's amazing, helpful. That's a good phrase to finish that response with, kind of the journey of learning. Because I want to turn back to Gurchaten, because there was that you rightly pulled us up a bit that we've talked a lot about employees, and therefore you have kind of employee networks, and you have corporate organizations themselves are closed that have a very good way to disseminate information. But often you find people who are disempowered economically and socially do end up in things. So you mentioned something like that, you know, you talked as a good example about the gig economy and perhaps regulation. So slightly off topic of employee, but taking your point about workers as well. How do we manage to push intersectional equality for people who may be in working in the gig economy, may be more disempowered and have less ability to happen to sit at a laptop and log into their, you know, intersectional network news or something like that?
So, hello, can you hear me now? Is that better? Right, sorry. So I think one of the key aspects here is, you know, ERGs don't agree in every single sector or in every single workplace. And how do gig workers organize themselves? So that is fundamental here. The providing a space for gig workers to organize, and there are more and more examples of that, where gig workers are in certain sectors such as delivery are beginning to organize and to challenge their employers as well. And, you know, and not just when it comes to issues of entitlements or the recognition in the workplace and for better pay. I think one of the key aspects here is as a lot of younger youth are pushed into the gig economy, there will be, I believe, a requirement for these spaces to be a lot more inclusive of different identities and needs as well. We see a growth in unions in certain parts of the economy and certain parts of the sector, which we haven't seen before, and a lot of queer youth are returning to those spaces. And then I think a point that Lax quite, you know, pointed out earlier on was that a lot of these ERGs have existed, but prior to them existing, we've always had them. They always were there. Unions were there for a very, very long time. So what ERGs have done is come into private sector spaces before where there were no unions, and to start those discussions and those dialogues. So what is the next step for those ERGs? Is perhaps even unionship. We saw that happen in Google, where the LGBTI group or the network did actually become its first union within Google. So I think having said that, those unions that are there already now need to take on board a lot of this important work in terms of when it comes to intersectionality. It hasn't been there before. In spaces that I've been in terms of the workers' movement, I often hear the issue that identity politics is diverging, it separates us, doesn't unite us, where in fact I would disagree with that. I think when it comes to the workers' movement, identities are actually unite us, bring us together even more, and different identities need to be there. I think it's a key issue that the workers' movement in particular need to pick up again, and I think that's happening. And how does that happen, and what platforms or what spaces are needed for that to happen are very, very critical as well, or important. Thank you.
Exactly. That feels a bit more like an amorphous question, because you have that, there's not a corporate structure, which is exactly sometimes how you disseminate information. Okay, I know time's not on our side, so the last question of this session I'll put to Sarah, referring to something else that you said earlier, Sarah. Back to kind of employees and corporates. Are there structural issues that, that would be natural parts of a corporate that actually kind of inhibit intersectionality? We talked about silos and disclosures, but even in kind of day-to-day operations, do you see things that could change? Is our mindset just wrong to manage intersectionality properly?
Wow, that's a great question. and to give you a brief answer, I think it does relate to issues around, the disability pay gap in terms of the underemployment and unemployment within the disability sector. The stats on disabled people who aren't in work are just scary, and just haven't really changed for decades. So I think, in terms of, if you just haven't got those people in your work environment, then they're not going to be there to be involved, to give that intersectional lens. I think larger corporates probably, I think it was Mel, wasn't it, earlier, that mentioned about, it was Iain, about larger corporates doing quite well in some of these things, and that's probably true with the likes of disability as well. I think there are issues of resource. We all know we'd all like each section of equality to have the same focus, but sometimes, because there is the Stonewall Index, because there are race charters, there's not the same focus on disability. So we shouldn't have a hierarchy, but we all know that certainly funding for EDI work is limited. And that's where, again, the point that I think Harry made earlier about, having EDI as part of your business structure, your business focus, as opposed to an add-on, just means you're going to have that larger approach, that larger framework to look at these issues. So I think, intersectionality is always going to be hard. But equally, it comes down to, the more we have that diverse workforce, whatever it might be, and the more we can work towards that, the more we will have improvement for all equality groups. So probably not a specific answer, Stephen. I'm just aware of the time, and that's my best shot at it.
No, that's brilliant, Sarah, because there is a principle in there. Of course, I was going to actually mention the kind of hierarchy of equality, so that was a way to wrap up. And I also think there's a question on invisibility, which pushes back to the need for organizations, so wider than corporates, to actively look at where there are gaps in their data, and that may be from the invisibility of certain groups within that.
Absolutely.
So I am super conscious. I did say I was going to. So firstly, thanks to the speakers for section 3. That's Lax, Gurchaten and Sarah. I am conscious, he's got mentioned a couple of times, and there was a challenge from Gurchaten that I will just bring Craig Beaumont on from the Federation of Small Business. And perhaps one of the things we talk about is data and exchange of best practice, to talk for a very brief 2 minutes, perhaps, on the new LGBT Business Hub from the Federation of Small Business. So perhaps a brief overview, Craig, and then I'll do the closing remarks and further actions.
Great, thank you, Steve. Yes, just very briefly, on FSB in the Hub. We're 160,000 small business owners and the self-employed, and we represent the 5.4 million small business and self-employed community. We lost 10% of the community during COVID. So we used to be 6 million. You'll have heard that figure before. We're now 5.4. The Hub is centered on member stories. So that's individual LGBT plus small business owners and self-employed who talk about their story. That's at the center, because we've had people who wanted to talk about their story, didn't have anywhere to go with it. So we thought, well, let's step into this space, exactly what Iain was talking about before, about business moving in and doing some good stuff. But what we found was an LGBT plus small business owner stepped away from traditional employed work to do this, to be themselves. So they did it because they wanted to be themselves and for their business to reflect them. Now, what they didn't necessarily do is thread through their sexuality and their sexual identity into their business. So we found people who've never expressed it to their staff, never talked about it as part of their business story, never realized actually that it was part of their business story, when in fact it was a fundamental part. So that's what really trying to do, is trying to get human beings to stand up and talk about it. And I think that's, listening to some of those contributions today, there is a bit of that I just wanted to kind of finish off with, which was in reaction to our Hub, which you can find online very easily. We did have different groups react differently. We had a very small, but we did have a bit of a backlash, you know, a homophobic backlash. Why are you working with something that's an ideology? Apparently the rainbow flag is an ideology. Are you now in some control of some woke group? So I think you've got different groups you need to think about with this whole area. There's the LGBT community itself, and having people who are LGBT plus stand up and talk about the story is vital. You've mentioned the large corporates. There's only 7,000 of them in the UK. There are 5.5 million small businesses. So, I mean, it's easier to talk to 7,000 than it is 5.5 million. And of the 5.5 million, 4 million of them don't employ anyone. They're sole traders. So how do you talk to these people? And I think it's less about actually data and regulation, because the last thing you want to do to a small business owner is, the only time that they will probably have to think about their business is probably, I don't know, maybe once or twice a week on a Friday night when they're not running their business. So you don't want it to be a big form or a toolkit or some new regulatory guidance. You want to inspire them to do the right thing. And to get small business owners to do that, you need a small business owner who's done it. And then a small business owner will either feel, oh, that looks like a good thing that I should be doing, or actually they get the feeling of FOMO. You know, you can see a small business owner at the moment struggling to recruit, and they see someone else using their LGBT+ inclusivity to attract better talent. On the specific point on chambers of commerce, I actually think moving away from you know, focusing so much on regulation as the answer, you want 1,000 initiatives to bloom. So we've got an LGBT Chamber of Commerce starting in the UK at the moment called Out Britain. It's starting from scratch. It's using a great product that they've done with EY on supply chain and diversity. Brilliant. Okay, showcase that. That's a good example. And then finally, you know, in FSB as an employer ourselves, we're a medium-sized business. Our biggest thing we've done internally, it wasn't from the LGBT community at all. It was our straight colleagues who set up an ally scheme with people to express support for our community. Brilliant. Take that as an example, show it off. So I think it's less about regulation and data and instruction. You can't really do pay gap reporting in quartiles where there's only 3 employees. So therefore find something that works for that business. And if you know, I think everyone on this call has a duty to kind of think of these inspirational stories, and that's the best weapon against the other side, and to get the message across.
Great. Thanks, Craig. That was good wrap up. So I have a few seconds left to just finish up. So clearly the need for data exchange through lived experiences and collections. So there's an obligation on governments, corporates, etc. Lastly, this is an ongoing discussion. So firstly, thank you all for attending. I know I didn't get to all the questions, which is the usual issue. I know what's going to happen is the team at the LGBT+ Commission and Kira will be contacting you, all the people attendees, to gather any more points. So this is not your last opportunity to input. Examples of best practice and policy recommendations would be great. Clearly, everybody highlighted some areas where data was sometimes incomplete or missing, and that's probably part of all of us in a very light touch way. I'm always conscious of that for the SME community. Otherwise, thank you very much for your 2 hours. I hope it was helpful, and I'm sure that we will see each other again very soon. So thank you so much.